Welcome, guys. Welcome back to Minko's Corner. Today, this is the first video of the day. I'm gonna do two, so stay tuned. This is a video that was recommended for me from a subscriber. Hey, man, welcome. Uh, this video is about every country England has invaded, and it's visualized. It's by Real Life 4. Go check them out. They're an amazing channel, apparently. But I think I've already I don't know if I've seen this video, but I think I've seen like a something that was similar to this. But I know pretty much. I have a pretty good like knowledge when it comes to the countries that the British Empire had invaded. So it won't be as surprising, but I'm sure I'll be surprised here and there. And I hope you learn from this video. I hope you like my reaction. Leave a like. See ya.
This video is made
Oh,
possible by CuriosityStream. Watch all of my videos early and ad-free, or watch the world. The English and later the British have been responsible for invading and conquering more countries and people than any other nation in human history. And honestly, it's startling just how many places they've been to. In this video, I'm going to do my best at attempting to visualize all of Britain's invasions and conquests for you, continent by continent, in as brief a time as possible. So let's begin with the closest continent to Britain, Europe.
Yeah.
Ireland was the first target of British conquests and was invaded as early as 1169. Within 400 years of gradual conquests, the entire island was ruled by the British and remained
Yep.
that way until most of it was granted independence in 1921.
Most of it.
Historically, France has probably been invaded by the English more times than any other country in the world.
I mean-
Just take a look at this huge list of invasions.
Let's see here. The invasion of Brittany. Okay, I don't know about that. I know that France invaded England first with William the Conqueror, who was French. But anyways, reconquest of Normandy. So they lost Normandy. Okay, 100-Year War, 1453. Yeah, the fall of what's called Constantinople. Invasion of Picardy. Invasion of I don't know most of it. Anglo-French War. Don't know about that. 9-Year War. Never heard of it. War of the Spanish Succession, I know about that. War of the Austrian Succession, I don't know about that. 7 Years War, heard about it, don't know about it. French Revolutionary War, yeah. And then the Napoleonic Wars, where the next video will be.
There's not even enough time to talk about a third of these, and for a time, all of this territory inside of
Yeah.
modern France was
Oh.
directly controlled by the English,
Yeah.
with Calais being the final piece that fell in 1557. Well, except for that time when the British took over Corsica for a couple years. The British continue to invade Spain by the millions every winter, but in the past, they've come with a
Yeah.
lot less friendly intentions. English and later British soldiers invaded under the Black Prince in 1367.
Gibraltar, they haven't given it up
continued
yet.
on through the first, second, third, and fourth raids on Cadiz, and that time when the British took over Gibraltar and Minorca. They gave Minorca back,
Yeah,
but
Gibraltar,
decided
right.
on keeping Gibraltar forever. In
Yeah.
recent history, the British
Get the
have
fuck outta
invaded
here.
Belgium in order to support the Belgians. But that wasn't always the case. They conducted two pretty large-scale invasions of modern-day Belgium in 1654 and again in 1701. And Flanders itself was ruled by the English for a few years in the
I mean, does it count as Belgium if at the time it was France or the Netherlands or the Spanish Netherlands? Like,
14th century. The Netherlands was one of England's historical arch rivals, and so there's
Yeah.
been plenty of invasions
Trade.
going in this direction across the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1940, the British technically invaded and took over Iceland peacefully for a year in order to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Germans.
I knew
This
about
was
that.
heavily protested by the Icelandic government at the time, so in my books, it still counts as an invasion.
course.
Italy, of course, was invaded by the British Army during the Second World War as well in 1943, but there were plenty of invasions before then, dating back to Richard the Lionheart's invasion.
Whoa, what the hell is this? So between 1190 and 1718, there was no invasion by the British in Italy? Whoa, I didn't know that.
1190.
And then they,
Germany, too,
ramped
was
it up.
obviously invaded by the British Army in 1945, and northwestern Germany was occupied by the British for 3 years until 1948.
And they still
But a
have
lot of
military
German
bases in
territory was
Germany,
ruled
by the way.
Britain long before then. The islands of Heligoland were British for most of the 19th century, and the Kingdom of Hanover was effectively ruled under a personal union
Yeah.
for over a
Victoria the
century
First.
between 1714
You're a
and
chick.
1837. Austria was
You can't
also
have it.
invaded in 1945, and the southwest of the country was occupied occupied for a decade.
So basically
Norway
it's
was
all World
invaded
War
in
II here.
1810 and 1812 during the Napoleonic Wars when it was a part of Denmark-Norway because Denmark was aligned to France, so obviously Denmark was invaded during that time as well. Finland, Estonia, and Latvia were all briefly invaded by small units during the Crimean War against Russia because they were all part of the Russian Empire at the time, and of course, Russia itself was invaded then too.
Oh my god! Oh my! Look how ugly Russia looks. I'm sorry to saying ugly, but you know when you look at Russia, what Russia looked like before the First World War happened, it was a country that went all the way to Finland, Estonia, all the way to down here. All this, even Poland was Russian, and they lost all that land. Oh my god!
It was in 1918 when the British took over a large chunk of northern Russia for a time in their fight against the Bolsheviks. The territory of modern Ukraine was invaded by British army units during the Crimean War. The British took over the Croatian island of Vis between 1807 and 1814 during their fight against Napoleon. The British army had boots and guns on the ground in Bosnia recently between 1992 and 95 fighting against the Bosnian Serbs, and around the same time the RAF also carried out bombing strikes against Serbian Serb targets in Serbia in 1999. Montenegro was briefly blockaded and invaded in 1913 during the First Balkan War. The British owned the westernmost Ionian islands of Greece between 1815 and 1863 before they gave them back, while Bulgaria was invaded and almost entirely occupied by the British Army between 1918 and 1919 at the end of World War I. Cyprus was a British protectorate between 1878 and 1914 when they decided to just outright annex it to piss off the Turks, and it remained annexed until 1960.
Yeah, and then they give it up, and Cyprus is like, yeah, we're free. And then the Turkish are like, hey, bitch, wait.
For two small chunks that are still British today. Turkey itself was massively invaded by the British during World War I, and part of it was occupied between 1919 and 1923. That wraps up Europe, so let's move on to Asia next.
Here we go!
Modern-day Israel and Palestine, as well as Jordan, were British-controlled from the end of World War I to 1948 and 1946, respectively. Lebanon and Syria were both occupied from the Vichy French government briefly during World War II. Iraq was ruled between 1919 and 1932 and invaded again during the Second World War, and again in 1991, and again in 2003. Kuwait was a colony for over 60 years until 1966. Georgia and Azerbaijan were both invaded and occupied right at the end of World War I for a year. Iran has been invaded at least 3 times, with the most notable example being the joint Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941. Turkmenistan was invaded in 1918 to prevent Bolshevik influence from spreading any further. Afghanistan is a favorite British invasion spot since it's been invaded in 1839, 1878, 1919, and again in 2001. Qatar, Bahrain, the United
And they never were able to take it, Well, at least,
Arab Emirates and Oman were all controlled by the British until the early 1970s, while a chunk of Yemen was controlled for over a century between 1839 and 1967. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka were all, of course, invaded many times and outright ruled by the British Empire in parts for nearly 2 centuries between 1757 and 1947. Nepal was invaded in 1814 but never successfully conquered. Bhutan was invaded in 1772 and again in 1864 and was sort of conquered as a protectorate between 1910 and 1948.
Sort of?
Myanmar
38
was
years
invaded in
is sort of?
1826 and was definitely successfully conquered and ruled through 1947. Thailand was briefly invaded in 1945 since they were allied to Japan in World War II, and so was Vietnam in the same year, but that was to support the French government against the growing independence movement. Malaysia and Singapore were each conquered and ruled up until the 1950s and 1960s. Brunei was conquered and ruled up until the 1980s, whereas the Philippines were briefly invaded during the 7 Years' War. China got invaded a lot, and Hong Kong was a colony until as recently as 1997. And while not outright invaded,
China got
Japan
fucked.
That's
why China has a lot of, anger issues nowadays, because now, they're not bullied anymore. Now they're the bully. They have strength, they have money. Fuck your ass.
Occupied following World War II between 1946 and 1952. And finally, Indonesia was invaded a bunch during the Napoleonic Wars since it was a Dutch colony aligned to France at the time. Next up, Oceania. Australia and New Zealand, of course, were invaded by the British and established as colonies that each gained independence in 1931. Papua New Guinea was also a British colony for a time, as were the island countries of Fiji, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Let's move back over to...
What's really funny is that uh, all the other nations, or at least maybe I'm wrong here, but all the other nations, when they get decolonized, they change their flags. You know? No, no. The British don't do that. If you were colonized by the British, you keep their flag at the corner of your own flag. So your flag will all have the British. You know, like all the nations, New Zealand, Australia, Fiji, you know, you name it. I mean, even Hawaii has a British flag, which I don't know why. You know, not Canada, but I mean, why is that so prevalent from ancient, or at least previous British colonies, and why do other countries change their flags right away?
To Africa next, which the British have
They
violently visited a lot.
fucking
In
nicked
terms of
that
just places the British outright colonized after invasions, there's the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa.
They made a little
along with parts
highway,
of
you know?
modern-day Somalia and Guinea. Senegal was briefly invaded and had some of their coastline taken over in the 1700s, while during the Second World War, the British invaded the French colonies of Djibouti, Madagascar, and Comoros after they aligned themselves with the Nazi Vichy regime, and the Italian colonies of Libya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, although they had also invaded Ethiopia much earlier in 1868. And as German colonies right before World War I, the British also invaded Togo and Cameroon without annexing them afterwards. For the final area of the world left to discuss, let's move over to the Americas. All of Canada was a British colony until 1931, while Newfoundland remained until 1949.
They were a colony for 200 years?
The United States, of course, was a colony until 1776, and was invaded again in 1812, and the modern states of Oregon and Washington were claimed right up until 1846. As far as other outright British colonies here go, there was the Bahamas, Jamaica, Belize, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, St. Lucia, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. Besides colonies, Cuba was invaded and occupied during the Seven Years' War in 1762. Haiti was invaded in 1793 during the French Revolutionary Wars. The Dominican Republic was invaded way back in 1655 in an attempt at conquest under Oliver Cromwell.
I always wonder why Haiti and the Dominican Republic were separate. Is there like a, because if you're gonna conquer the whole island. You're not gonna conquer half of it. So was it because half of it was conquered by the French and the other half by the British? Something like that, I'm gonna guess.
Well, parts of the east coast of Honduras and Nicaragua were conquered and ruled for nearly 2 centuries until 1819. They sent the Navy to invade Mexico in 1861 to force them to repay some debts, and during the splendidly named War of Jenkins Ear, aka the more lame-sounding War of the Austrian Succession, the British invaded a lot of Spain's colonies, including Panama, a huge one into Colombia, and ultimately Peru. In 1796, the British took over Suriname because it was a Dutch colony, and they were allied with the revolutionary French and later Napoleon. They also invaded Martinique and Guadeloupe because they actually were French during the Napoleonic Wars. Venezuela was invaded in 1902 as part of the so-called Venezuela crisis to force the country to repay some debts they had defaulted on, kind of like Mexico, while Argentina and Uruguay were both invaded during the Napoleonic Wars as well in 1806 when Spain and her colonies were still allied with Napoleon. And that pretty much sums up all of the territory the British have ever ruled and all of the countries this small island has ever invaded. There are a total of 65 countries today who celebrate their independence days from the British Empire. The Empire used to rule over a quarter of all the world's land at the same time and was the biggest empire in human history. And in total, today.
How has the British fallen? I mean, you go from the peak. All empires will fall eventually, The British Empire, I mean, the country still exists, barely. They're dealing with the independence movement from Scotland and Wales, which has always surprised me when this is a question, and don't take it wrongly, but it is what it is. If you're gonna conquer, let's say you're England, 500 years ago you conquered Scotland. Well, it wasn't conquered; it was like basically unified. But or a better example, Wales. You conquer Wales. You take Wales, and then you want to keep it. You want to keep it. Why don't you force your culture, your English culture, upon Wales? Why don't you make it so that Wales is a prohibited language? Why don't you only teach English in Wales? so to eradicate the culture, so you're able to absorb Wales into England. So there was never an independence movement later on down the line. It's always surprised me, like so many countries who conquered other countries, they never eradicated the culture. And that's one way to, I'm not saying you have to eradicate the culture. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying it's logical, right? If you're the Ottoman Empire and you're gonna conquer, you name it, I don't know, Greece, for example. You're gonna conquer whatever it is you're gonna conquer. Why don't you eradicate the culture so that the people who live in Greece or do not consider themselves Greek anymore? They consider themselves, uh, you know, Turks. Why do you leave them, or are you suppressing them? But some people survive, and then centuries go by, and they somehow survive, and they thrive, and they gain their independence somehow. I don't understand that.
Today, there have been 117 modern countries that have been aggressively invaded by the British Armed Forces during some point in their histories,
Yeah.
representing a total of 60% of all the world's nations, which is almost the same number of
Whoa! Look at this map. Look at this map. Look how beautiful it is. I know it sounds really bizarre, but it is. It's so red. Um, Jesus Christ, man, they were everywhere. Mostly everywhere. They didn't go into like all this African territory. That was all French here. That was the Congo here. That was German here. Portuguese. They didn't go that much into like Latin America in terms of conquests. China was fucked repeatedly, but never conquered. Well, they took Hong Kong. Um, Saudi Arabia was weirdly left alone. Huh, I didn't know that. Didn't they go through Saudi Arabia during this First World War? And yeah,
countries that you can watch this video in. YouTube is available in 130 countries now, or about 2/3 of them, but the algorithm that YouTube uses won't always work the way you think or want it to. It determines which videos succeed, which ones don't, and which ones you end up seeing recommended, but it doesn't always line up with the kinds of videos I'm producing here that I think you guys will end up enjoying watching. So that's why a big group.
Alright, so this is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this. It was really good. It was really good. It sort of it helps you visualize where the British were, which was basically where I mean they took over the world in many ways, and now 100 years later they're no longer as relevant as they used to be. Two world wars. I mean that's with it. One world war where you start your decline, and the second where you're dead. Uh, and it is what it is. And I wonder if that's gonna happen with the United States. Now the problem is if there's another world war, nukes will be involved, and then hundreds of millions might die. I don't know. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys the next time. Leave a like,